I start with giving you a little bit of a background, how come that I speak here today. It was Chris Martin who participated in a summer school I organized with a colleague of mine from the other university you see on the footer of the slide here. I'm from the University of Applied Sciences in Kaiserslautern, and the other one is the University of Applied Sciences in Heilbronn. And my colleague is Sebastian Kaiser-Jovi, which is a long-term friend, associate, acquaintance of Chris Martin as well. And we invited him to our summer school for sustainable development this year in June. And of course, when you're for 5 days in the same setting, you have a lot of exchange on all kinds of topics. And we introduced him to our conceptual framework for our summer school, which we not strongly introduced to the students because of it may be a bit too complex, but we kind of orient what we do in this educational setting strongly on that framework, which has been also a subject of publications a few times now. And he seemed convinced that this could be a good contribution to this conference, and that many of the people who work in his field, especially when it comes to volunteer work, could profit from this kind of framework, and asked me to introduce you to it. And so I'm very happy to be able to speak to you today, and I want to thank you very much for joining my talk here. And I hope you, at the end of the talk, find that that this may be of some use to you. So what we're doing here is the big question is, when you work with volunteers, when you do, let's say, development projects or project development in settings or in with objectives that are not solely economic, you are faced with a very strong diversity of things you have to care about, and the very first thing is, how do you define success, and what measures do you implement that tell you that you were successful? And that is kind of the starting point of what this conceptual framework is. So it is rooted in strategic management, and there are several strategy models that are being integrated into that whole strategy concept here. And the first one is probably the most interesting one. It's the so-called logic model, which is not very common if you look at strategy literature. And I more or less stumbled over it about 10, 12 years ago, when I talked to the head of the Switzerland cultural organization called Pro Helvetia, and they are responsible for promoting Swiss culture around the world, in Switzerland and around the world. In Germany, we have something similar. It's called the Goethe Institute. I don't know if the UK has something like that. And we were talking about how to plan and evaluate arts and cultural projects, and he directed me to their guidelines of how they plan and evaluate projects, and they were using the logic model. And at that time, it kind of said, oh, well, this is very well logical. This is very interesting as a tool, and why have I never seen anything about it? And I never saw a strategy textbook that used it. And I did a bit of digging and found out that the logic model is actually has been invented by a consulting company in the 60s for the American Ministry of Foreign Aid. So if you do development in let's say third world countries, you also don't have really economic numbers, parameters where you can orient your measures on. So they needed something else. And you probably will say, well, this is totally everyday ideas, but I've never seen it as a like a really closed concept in there. So then we go to PESTEL, which is an environmental model. You can use other strategy models here. And I'm going through very quickly through all of those because most of them you probably already know and have seen before. So if I'm too quick, just let me know, and I elaborate a little bit on those. Otherwise, I try to not bore you with details on concepts you already have heard of before. Okay, what's the logic model? Well, the logic model is a good way to describe and evaluate a program, a project, an initiative. And it presents a logical argument why things are done in a specific way, how the project is oriented to specific needs of stakeholders. Those may be customers, and it explains actually the, let's say, if it would be a boxes and arrows model, it explains the arrows more than the boxes. And it's about to provide accountability information to stakeholders. That means that everybody knows first what we're doing and why we're doing it the way we're doing it. And they can also align their decisions with the whole project idea. And the basic structure of the logic model is nothing new to you. It is about inputs, activities, output, outcome, and impact. But if you arrange it in this way and you make these distinctions, several ideas pop up in how do you frame those aspects that have to be put in under those headlines. So of course, to do any initiative, you need inputs and activities. You need to have something, to do something, and that produces some kind of output. And that's something you can directly influence. But after the output, there's nothing more you can directly influence. You can only indirectly influence it, because the outcome is always the result of several outputs. And an impact is always the result of several outcomes. So we have a systematic and visual way to present and share our understanding of the relationships among the resources you have and the activities you want to plan. And as I said, the more important part are the arrows, how these activities are linked to the results of the program that we are trying to achieve. And that's why the planning process, that would be the evaluation process, and the planning process always starts at the end of it, like you learn it in every planning or strategic planning class. You start with the question, okay, what's the impact? What's it supposed to be? What's the long-term impact? Maybe the impact over several projects, long-term, short-term. And you see down here with the description, you have only in the input, activities, and output section, you have things that are economically quantifiable. And later there's maybe some measurements, but there's always interpretation involved as well. And when it comes to the impact, sometimes that's totally idealistic, and there's no measure at all, or you have to define how you want to measure it and what an impact is for you. And so there's different approaches involved here: functional, instrumental approaches for the first half of the model, and a rather institutional approach for the second half. Meaning that depending on where you start and where your different stakeholder objectives come in, you can also organize the different attitudes toward a certain project with this tool, because some people may come in and say, well, we have to improve our image, or we have to become more famous with this initiative. That's clearly an impact. But other people say, no, we want more sales. We need to have better sales, and that's of course an outcome. And so it always depends on what your different stakeholders are focusing at, and then you can organize those objectives within the structure of the logic model, and of course can have a basis for communication on what needs to be done to achieve that result, and what that result may consequently lead. There's a lot of questions in these different categories that can be asked if you do the planning process. As I said, I don't want to go into the details of planning that you do every day and probably know way more about than I do. But again, you have a way of organizing these aspects here, and you can say, okay, what are the resources we need? And again, this is rather from a planning perspective. You would start maybe at the end, but I'm starting at the left side now with the input, excuse me, and say, yeah, of course, first we determine what are the project requirements, funding, materials, and so on. And of course, which people do what activities. Is there effective cooperation? Is there an efficient task management? Is the budget planned correctly? And of course, in the lower part of this table, you see what are the tools typically used to plan and evaluate this. So you have a work breakdown structure, you may have a budgeting process that tells you, of course, or gives you answers to those questions. It starts getting interesting with the outputs. Did we achieve certain objectives? Did we adhere the budget? Did certain tasks that we defined, did they get accomplished? And of course, there's a lot of tools to measure that. There's a typical accounting, there's performance measurement, there's balanced scorecard, there are key performance indicators and the like that you can use to have all kinds of measures about the output. And still, when it comes to outcomes, you still have a pretty broad array of methods. You want to find out, did you spark public interest? Did you get a certain public visibility? Did you have a number of visitors or attendees? How was your customer satisfaction? How was the media attention? Did you gain profits or market share? And all these things, of course, can be measured, but not directly influenced typically, because you have to create certain outputs to achieve them. And of course, polling, media clipping, break-even analysis, sales reports, lead reports are the typical tools to find out how you performed toward your outcomes. And then that's why there's a blank spot on the lower right corner here. There's the impact where you have to define how you define it and how you want to measure that. So how do you measure if you had a growth and prominence? You can do a media clipping, polling, and all these things, but it's up to you how you weigh those things and how you evaluate those toward the question if you had an impact. Did you raise awareness? Yeah, that can be a very indirect answer to that question. Maybe politicians created an initiative afterwards, they got aware of something and you made them aware. And then you certainly had an impact, but there's no measurement tool for that except for observing what happens in the world. Are you a reference for others? Are other people copying you? Did you gain recognition or political influence for that matter? So there's those questions, and there's not really one thing that can measure that. So that's where the logic model helps you making a logical argument. The term logic is actually not very good as a choice of words here. It's more like you want to say, well, if we do these things, it is probable, so there's a probability to achieve that output, and that output will probably lead to that outcome, and that outcome will probably lead to that impact. But from a marketing perspective, the probability model isn't that catchy as the term logic model. So, and it's based on a very simple strategic principle that you can have, or usually have, several strategies that lead to a certain result. So it's the do versus the get part, and you do certain things that are described in several strategies, and you get one result. And that's the problem. How do you explain which one of those strategies are more or less responsible for the result? And that's where the logic model helps you. Let's make an example here. You want to improve your health. So things you can do is exercise. You can focus on your nutrition or stress reduction. Those are typical strategies people do when they want to improve health. But which one has the most impact? Well, we don't really know. Usually we say they all work, because when you recognize that your health improved, we say, yeah, well, that's the combination of things you have to do. But you can't really say if it was more due to the exercise you did, or through your change in consumption, food consumption. So you try to make a logical argument here, and sometimes maybe directly some of those strategies won't directly improve your health, but it won't only work in combination with another strategy. So these things are interlinked, and in a lot of strategic management environments, we don't ask those questions. It's more or less an unspoken assumption that we assume, yeah, well, this will have an effect on the outcome or on the impact, and we can't really tell. So the logic model tries to find explanations how much the different strategies will affect your results. So, and of course we extended the model a little bit. So the things on the lower part of this slide you already saw on the other slides. It's just smaller here and with less color. And we just wanted to show here how the process is working. And you see on the right side the stakeholders. Every stakeholder has their objectives, and those may be things that are hard to determine, like sustainability, resilience, diversity, social impact, economic impact. So those are typical impact categories, objectives, and you bring them into the planning process. The planning process starts with the impacts and works its way to what do we have to do to achieve that. And then you have the realization process, which is the lower part, and then you can always compare. Did we do what we actually want to do? Did it have the results? Did we get the output we wanted? Did we get the outcome we wanted, and so forth? And that means you can evaluate by comparison, and you get one of three results. You got exactly what you wanted. You got less than you wanted, or you got more than you wanted. But that's very binary almost. So there's also the greater result. But to define a result, you have to go a little bit further and extend to other strategy models. And that's why we try to come up with a more holistic approach and add other strategy models to or group them around the logic model. The first one is the so-called PASTEL model. Most of you probably know this one. It's a model to analyze the environment. PASTEL is abbreviation stands for political, economic, social, technological, ecological, and legal aspects of the environment of your organization or your project or your initiative. So all these aspects are being analyzed, and out of this idea, you get a lot of information to make assumptions about what your stakeholders want. Actually, you identify all kinds of stakeholders, and you can also make assumptions what their objectives are. Or if you want to go deeper in the analysis, you ask them what their objectives might be and put it in your strategy model directly. The next one is connected to this. This is the network analysis, where you try to find out how your stakeholders and institutions around your project are connected to each other. Networking is something that you all do probably to a very large extent, and I don't have to lecture you on that. So I'm going a bit further, and then there's also the idea of, for instance, analyzing the environment with a cluster analysis developed by Michael Porter, which you all probably know from the 5 Forces. He did this one as well, and has his own idea of how to describe an environment, which can all be helpful. You don't have to do all of those. It's just a suggestion what can be done to make an environmental analysis. Then we have the stakeholder approach. The stakeholder approach also is a very common strategic tool, usually depicted in the Mendelow matrix, and it's the power interest matrix. It's another name for it, and you determine your stakeholders by how much they are interested in what you do and how much power they have to support you or to be in the way. And then there's 4 generic strategies here, how to deal with those stakeholders. Of course, if you want to do more, if you want to find out how close to you certain stakeholders are, you can do the onion model, which is also a typical stakeholder model you can integrate into the larger strategy here. Then one that is very common in business environments right now is the business model canvas. And you're going to see we not only integrated the business model canvas, but we also stole the canvas idea from these guys, which they didn't really invent. It was there before, but they made it very popular. And you probably all know this one, where they have those 9 elements of a business idea or a business model. And you can describe a business model very easily. And there's also quite a bit of literature out there right now that explains how you can modify the business model canvas so it becomes a public service canvas. So it can also be applied to public service organization. And last but not least, there's the idea of analyzing the organization. We suggest here the 4-frame model by Bowman and Deal. It's also called reframing the organization, and it's a very holistic approach to organization. It combines a lot of organization theories under its roof here, and you basically categorize an organization by those 4 frames. Doesn't mean that you have to characterize your organization in a way that it fits into one of those frames, but rather every organization has those 4 frames, and you can look at an organization from different perspectives to come up with an idea here on how your organization makes decisions. In a nutshell, this concept tells you, well, there's a structural frame, and this one's about order. There's a human resource frame, it's about satisfaction, and there's a political frame that is about responsibility, and the most neglected, but if you follow Bowman and Deal, the most important frame is the symbolic frame, where it is about the meaning that an organization provides for its customers, for its members, for its employees, of course, for all of its stakeholders. And the basic idea behind this is, how does the organization make decisions? And to have an idea about that tells you a lot about why certain stakeholders have certain objectives that also, again, flow into your larger model, your strategic thinking model, the logic model. And how are these all connected? This is gets now a little bit complicated with a lot of arrows.
Seems to have froze a bit, Timo. Anybody hear me? Rolf, can you hear me? Unmute yourself.
I think it's just Timo's gone offline. I'll give him a couple of minutes to see if he comes back. Oh, he's back.
Was I gone?
Yeah, just for about 10 seconds.
Okay. Yeah. So I started with this slide here. You see here in the idea that the logic model is in the center of everything, and its most important informational feed is the objectives of the stakeholders, and we can distinguish stakeholders into external and internal stakeholders. And so we have on the side of the external stakeholders, we have the environment analysis that explains those, and the stakeholder objectives, the internal stakeholder objectives, are being analyzed in the 4-frame model. And of course, the business model directly, on one hand, directly feeds into the logic model. On the other hand, it is connected, of course, with the environment, because every business model is supposed to have a connection to the environment of a company. So, and what you see here are that there are 3 arrows here that have a little bit of a description. So we integrated Agilis learning cycles in here, which are which is the so-called triple loop learning. So there's the single loop, the first loop. This is the question: are we doing things right? Yeah, so that's the question of the results that need to be compared with the objectives. So are the results what our goal was? Did we achieve what we wanted to do? It's this most simple one here. And then we have the double loop. That is also starting with the results. Are we doing the things right? Oh, excuse me. Are we doing the things right was the first one. The second one is, are we doing the right things? Getting confused with my own slide here. And that's the question of, yeah, is the business model correct? Yeah. Are we doing the right things? Should we do something else to achieve the impact we want to have? And of course, the last one is, how do we decide what is right? And that is, of course, an arrow that goes from the results to the four-frame model and how decisions are being made, what the right thing is in any kind of organization. And that, of course, can be divided in those four frames and being analyzed there if a company is more focused on structure or on human resources or on political aspects for that matter. So this is the concept of the connections within the model. I did the triple loop learning slide here again, so you have a better overview on how this actually works originally. So the first loop, the single loop, is the strategy, tools, techniques, and tactics are those appropriate to achieve our results. And the double loop, are we doing the right things? So that's the underlying assumptions of that what we do will lead to a certain result. And the triple loop, how do we decide? Yeah, context, values, culture, mission, that's all what you find in Bowman and Beal's reframing organization. And then, of course, you iterate. So it's of course a repeating process. So this slide, you probably can't read anything on this one. That's just, again, all the canvases combined with the arrows that show the triple loops. And of course, this is getting quite complicated. I'm not going to talk about it, but if you put everything together, this is what you get. And of course, nobody can work with that very nicely. So what we did, we stole the canvas from Osterwalder and Pigneur from the business model canvas and made our own strategy canvas. And here you can see all the boxes from all the models. And yeah, our basic idea is that we have a huge whiteboard in our classes, and hopefully in the organizations we consult with, and say, okay, let's go through this. What's the impact we want to have, and how does it affect all the other boxes in this strategy canvas? And I don't have to tell you, this maybe takes more than one strategy day, one strategy workshop to come up with ideas for all of those boxes, what to find out and how to approach those things. But it's a good starting point, attacking this with hundreds of Post-its and collecting ideas. And by the way, as a side effect, which is not really a side effect, which is probably the main effect, create a narrative for the project. And then you can tell everybody, yeah, well, we did our research, we did our homework, and we addressed any possible aspect of it. And this is what we came up with, what we think is the right thing to do and how to do it. So that's our strategy canvas. And as I said, this is developing for over 10 years now, and is kind of the background for what we teach to students, and from time to time give them a peek into that, and have been very successful, in our opinion, of course, explaining all these connections to people who usually only learn these things separately and in thematic silos that are usually not getting connected to each other. And that's what we're doing. And yeah, and we apply it in our summer school, where we have industry partners every year. And we haven't met one who wasn't convinced that this did a very good service in trying to organize ideas and come up with consequences. And so was Chris Martin this year, and that's why I was invited to come here and share this with you. I hope you find it compelling and are interested in it. And please, if you can have my slideshow if you want to, I can provide it. we are public servants and professors here. There's not really an economic aspect to us that we want to sell some consulting hours here. But of course, if you want to go deeper into this and want to have some guidance with it, feel free to contact us. And if you want to cooperate with us, maybe in the summer school, which is 1 week where we bring a bunch of students to Greece and have them work on a project for 1 week. And if you're interested in something like that and stay with us there and work with us on your project that you bring into the summer school, we are, of course, delighted to talk to you. So yeah, this is what I try to bring to you today. And I hope you have questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Timo. There's a lot to take in there. Are there any questions?
That was really interesting. Thank you, Timo.
Thank you.
Have you got a website or something, Timo? You could just stick in the link or your email address if you want to get in touch.
Yes.
Write some more.
Directly here in the chat, or
yeah, if there's something you know off the top of your head, you can put it in the chat, or you can provide it for us later on.
I will do this.
It's interesting. Yeah, I do find it very interesting. I'm trying to think how I can relate that to some of to our customers. And I suppose there's lots of ways, you know, in terms of what they're fundamentally trying to achieve by offering the volunteer, you know, a volunteer service. I mean, I always kind of take the same approach you mentioned there, is what you're trying to achieve, then work backwards. And I think a lot of people miss that. It's when you're kind of when you've been working in it for years, you kind of realize that's definitely the way to do these things. You got to figure out what you're trying to achieve and look at everything else before that, and how it affects the different stakeholders and like the political environment, like you say, and then assess them before you know how to actually achieve your goal. I'm trying to think. Even with, I see it at a more simplistic level with reports. I find often when people ask for reports and they say, oh, I need a report in the system to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And I always say, fundamentally, what's the question you want to answer? You got to work backwards from there, and you know, and who has to be involved in getting that data in place so you can actually answer that question. Are you capturing the right information? I do find it's fascinating. Thank you, Timo. Luke's got his hand up. You want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Timo. Thank you very much. Really interesting to seeing it all the processes sort of laid out. What I was thinking, it's kind of related to what Steve mentioned. Sometimes kind of going through the sort of process, we get given a desired outcome and we kind of have to work backwards from there. So I work in a university, so oftentimes it will be something like we've decided, some committee leader will say, we've decided that 20% of students should volunteer and we need you to do this. And actually, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how you can almost, I guess, using some of the process that you've got here, kind of, it feels like a bit retroactive, because it's almost like the outcome is not the one that we'd pick or we'd necessarily find, but it feels a bit like you're sort of flipping it and doing it the other way around, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a very that's exactly one of the questions that gets addressed with the logic model, because you not necessarily always start at the very end, like the impact. So there's a stakeholder coming to you, say, I need 20% more of X. Yeah. And then you say, okay, this would be, in your case, people volunteering, that's an outcome, I would say, and not an impact. The impact would be what is achieved by those 20% of students volunteering. And so you can tell your stakeholder there, well, okay, what are they supposed to volunteer for, and what should be the result of that volunteering activity on one hand, and on the other hand, you can deduct more or less to say, okay, if we want 20% more, a certain outcome or certain different outcomes need to be addressed. So we have to reach, if the university has 10,000 students, we have to reach at least 5,000 of them to have the the opportunity that 20% more than now are, like, you can crunch the numbers there and explain what huge kind of an effort that would mean to achieve this number. And then they maybe say, oh no, if it's that much of an effort, maybe 5% more is also a good number, because sometimes they just grab numbers out of the sky and say, well, this would be desirable. Yes, it would be for me desirable to be able to buy a luxury car for 5,000 euros, but no car company will offer it.
I completely agree. You're absolutely right. Actually, the example that I just gave is very much a sort of a good example of actually the 25% increase in students would be in the middle of that equation. So they would have determined they want to increase graduate outcomes, and in order to increase graduate outcomes, they've decided that this is the thing. So actually, the goal, I guess it's confusing sort of impact and the eventual outcome of it. But yeah, it's really good. I think using the bare stats of like, this is the number of students we have, especially when it might be talking about, for instance, like they want to engage a certain number of disabled students. Like, we know the number of disabled students that we have at the university. So on that basis, if that percentage is to increase, I think it's quite useful as a tool to be able to, like you say, go back to the management and say, this is the resource that would be required. If you visualize it, this is how many students we would have to get these opportunities in front of them, and then they actually have to go through with it, which I guess is the other
I think you're right, Luke. I always think it's that data, it almost shows you what controls are available to you, and you don't realize until you lay it all out in front of you in that fashion. You don't realize, okay, I can tweak this, and how much impact each of those controls is actually going to have on the final thing you're trying to achieve. So it lets you know, like you say, with disability, it's like, well, I can tweak that, but it doesn't matter if I turn them all the way up to a number 11. It's going to make very little impact on the final goal. But this one here, so you start to, and I think it's absolutely critical as well. I think that Timo was on about is first principles. I'm a big believer on it, and love or hate it, Elon Musk is a big believer on it as well. Listen to him chatting about it, and it's absolutely critical. What are you fundamentally trying to achieve? People say, sometimes a volunteer, they're like, well, I just want more people to volunteer longer. It's like, well, that's not what you're trying to achieve. What you're trying to achieve is the impact, is really the impact on the. So you've got to really understand fundamentally what you're trying to achieve, and not just quantify. People that I want people to log 1,000 hours. Log 1,000 hours of volunteering, but they don't actually do anything out there. That's pointless.
Sure.
You've got to fundamentally understand what you're trying to achieve. Sorry, Timo, jumping in there.
Yeah, and it's about the narrative. Again, you're telling somebody else what their narrative actually is. You say, if you say X percent means you're thinking about it like this, and then they think, oh no, that's not what I mean. Maybe, yeah. If they're not aware of how ridiculous their claim is, they probably get convinced that they should pick another number.
Yeah, you're 100% right. The number is often entirely arbitrary. we've encountered, and actually, it's sometimes the difficulty is that, I guess, using this sort of thing, but going forward as well, it might mean we can actually help them determine in advance a target that is more realistic, potentially. If they do involve us in those conversations, which they often don't, but it's always good to dream, isn't it?
Yeah. There's another question or a comment in the chat section here. I see Claire wrote, this could be a good tool to use as part of us linking with other people working in volunteer management. Yes, of course, and not only those. It is actually the most crucial part here is it's a communication tool. It's about the explanation of how do we approach that task, that project, that whole thing, and make it understandable for others. So it is sorry, sometimes I have to think about words a little longer because it's not my first language. It is not only about the ideas, but having a story around the connections between the things we try to do, between the things we were doing and the things we try to achieve. And being clear, having a clear idea on that is a very great help for others to understand why you're doing what you're doing and why you're doing it in a certain way. So yeah, very good comment, because it hits exactly what also the literature of the logic model tells us about it. Yes.